I have photographed London for 11 years. Not the postcards, not the tourist brochures. The real London, the one that breathes and sweats and occasionally surprises you at 9:30 in the morning when you thought you were just out for a walk. I carry a Canon R5 everywhere. It's a habit my wife calls obsessive and I call professional. On this particular Tuesday, I had no assignment, no client waiting. I just wanted to catch the autumn light on the mall before the tourist coaches arrived and turn the whole stretch into a car park with flags. So I was there early, very early. The fog was still sitting low across St. James's Park, the kind that softens everything, makes the trees look like they're sketched in pencil rather than planted in earth. You could just see the tops of the lampposts disappearing into the gray. London, when it's quiet like that, feels like a city that belongs to no one and everyone at once. I cut through past the park, took the path that runs alongside the old gate, and ended up where I usually end up when I'm wandering without purpose, on the pavement outside St. James's Palace, where the color court faces the street, and the guards stand in their little sentry boxes like they've been painted there by someone with too much red paint and too steady a hand. There were 2 of them on duty that morning. I'll call the first one Guard A, because I never caught his name, and what happened to him later wouldn't be fair to define him by. He was the one on the left, the one who would, in about 40 minutes, become the center of everything. He was young, late 20s, I guessed. He had the build of someone who had spent years training to stand still, which sounds simple, but is the opposite of simple if you've ever tried it. His posture was a kind of perfection that made you slightly ashamed of your own spine. The second guard I'll call Guard B, broader, a few years older, the kind of face that has been weathered by something, duty, cold mornings, or both. I set up about 15 feet away, close enough to compose a decent shot, far enough not to be a nuisance. I've learned the distance over the years. Guards don't like it when you crowd them. They can't react, and they know it, and being crowded when you can't react is its own quiet indignity. The fog was thinning by then. The light was going from gray to that particular shade of pale gold that only exists in London for about 20 minutes in autumn before it either brightens into a proper morning or gives up and returns to gray. I was trying to catch that light on the guardsman's bearskin, the way it can turn the black fur almost amber if you get the angle right. I got a few good frames. Then I lowered the camera and just stood there for a bit, the way you do when the light is doing the work and you just want to watch it. That's when I first noticed them. A small group had come through from Pall Mall, 4, maybe 5 people. Official-looking in that way that isn't about suits or badges, but about the speed they walk and the way they don't look at shop windows. 2 were clearly protection officers. The posture gives it away before anything else. One was a woman I didn't immediately recognize, in a camel coat with a collar turned up against the morning air. Beside her, a man I took to be an aide, because he was carrying a leather folder and speaking quietly while she wasn't really listening to him. They paused near the gate, not right at it, about 30 feet from where Guard A was standing. Protection officers did a quick visual sweep. Standard, professional, the sort of thing you only notice if you've been watching these situations long enough. Then the woman in the camel coat turned toward the palace frontage, and the morning light caught her face properly for the first time. It was Queen Camilla. I'm a photographer. I've shot events where members of the royal family were present. I've cropped enough frames to know a face when I see it. This was her, no question, not in any official capacity that morning, or at least not one that had been announced publicly. She was moving like someone who had simply decided to do something, and the small team around her had adjusted accordingly. That was my read, anyway. She looked at the palace, then she looked at the guards. And then she said something. I wasn't close enough to hear it clearly, just fragments carried by the still morning air. But I heard the tone. And I saw the face of the aide, who half smiled at whatever she said and then straightened again quickly, the way aides do when they're not sure if the smile was appropriate. One of the protection officers glanced at Guard A. Guard A did not move. Not a millimeter. That sounds like the right thing. Of course he didn't move, that's what guards do. But there was something in the specific quality of his stillness that morning that I can only describe as deliberate in a way that stillness usually isn't. Most stillness is passive. His wasn't. His was chosen in that moment in a way that registered even from 15 feet and through a camera viewfinder. I lifted the cannon and started shooting again. I didn't know why. I just had the feeling that something was about to happen that I'd want to have framed. Now I need to tell you what happened in the 30 minutes before this, because without it, the rest won't make sense. I had been there long enough to watch two tourists try to make guard a flinch. This is a thing people do. They record it on their phones and upload it and get 100,000 views, and I understand the entertainment value of it even if I don't admire the impulse. The tourists, a young couple, mid-20s, one with a selfie stick extended to its full embarrassing length, had tried everything, standing directly in front of him, making sudden noises. One of them did something that I think was meant to be a jump scare, which involved a sort of loud clap and a lurch forward. Nothing. Garda stared straight ahead. His eyes didn't shift, his jaw didn't tighten. He processed the world in front of him the way a wall processes weather. After several minutes of this, the couple had given up. The woman laughed and said something to her partner. I was close enough to hear this part. He's basically a statue. Honestly, I think there's no one home. She said it like it was a compliment and an insult simultaneously, the way people do when they're testing whether cruelty is permitted. I watched Guard A and thought he heard that. Of course he heard that. The palace wall is 30 feet behind him. Sound carries. He heard every word. And he didn't move. Now here's the thing that people always misread about the guards. The stillness isn't absence. It isn't vacancy. It isn't that the lights are off and nobody's home, the way the tourist woman implied. The stillness is a kind of density. It's everything compressed and controlled, not switched off. I'd spent enough time photographing them to know that the eyes are always moving, even when nothing else is. The tracking of the perimeter, the shift of focus from near to far and back again. The micro-adjustments in a body that has to remain still enough to look static while remaining alert enough to move in under a second if it needs to. But nobody sees that. They see the absence of fidgeting and conclude absence of intelligence. It's one of the oldest misreadings in the world. I thought about that as I watched the couple walk away, selfie stick deflating. Then Queen Camilla arrived. She had stopped walking now. She was looking at the guardsman, Garda specifically. I couldn't hear what she said to the aide beside her, but I watched the aide's face, and the aide's face told me enough. There was a smile there, not a cruel one, nothing like that. More like someone who has just made a gentle joke and knows it's landed. One of the protection officers, the one closer to the building, made a small gesture. Not toward Guard A, but in his general direction. An explanatory gesture, I thought, like he was offering context. Something about the schedule or the posting or what the guard had been standing there watching all morning. Camilla listened, then she looked at Guard A again. She said something else, short, sharp. The kind of sentence that ends with a slight upward inflection, even when it isn't technically a question. I still couldn't hear the words. I saw the reaction, though. The aide's smile turned smaller. The protection officer stopped making gestures. Everyone in that small group went a little quiet in the way that groups go quiet when something has shifted. Guard A didn't move. Camilla tilted her head slightly. That's the only way I can describe it. The head tilt of someone who has made a point and is waiting for the world to acknowledge it. She had the ease of a woman who is very used to the world acknowledging her points. I got the shot. The light was perfect, low gold, catching the brass buttons on his tunic, the slight mist still visible at the tree line behind the gate. Garda centered in the frame. Camilla visible on the left edge, turned slightly toward him. I lowered the camera, and then Guard A spoke. Not loudly. That's the first thing I need to say. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply spoke, in a voice that was precise and calm and had nothing apologetic about it in the way that real precision never does. I caught maybe 70% of it. Enough. He addressed her correctly. I registered that much. The right form, not mechanical, not overly formal, just correct. And then he said something that lasted no more than 12 seconds, maybe 15 at the outside. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a defense. It was a response, careful, accurate, and utterly without hesitation. I'm going to get to what he said. I want to tell it properly, but I also want you to understand the face of Queen Camilla in the second after he finished. Because I've photographed a lot of faces. I've captured people mid-surprise, mid-grief, mid-joy, mid-boredom. I've caught people in the moment just after they've heard something they weren't expecting. I know what the face does in those 2 seconds when the brain is catching up with the ears. What I saw on her face was not embarrassment. It was not annoyance. It was surprise, Genuine, unscripted, completely unguarded surprise. And then something else moved through her expression, something that looked from 15 feet away very much like respect. I raised the camera. I got the frame. Let me back up. Not all the way. Just far enough to give you what you need. Before Garda spoke, before any of this became the kind of morning I'm still thinking about months later, there was a moment that I missed at the time and only understood afterward, when I was sitting in my car eating a cheese roll from the sandwich shop on German Street and going through the morning's frames. It was in the 40 minutes before Queen Camilla arrived. I've told you about the tourists, the couple with the selfie stick, the woman who said, "I think there's no one home." What I didn't tell you was what happened in the 10 minutes before them, something quieter, less theatrical, and in retrospect far more significant. A child had come up to the gate. Not alone, there was a father somewhere behind, pushing a buggy on the phone, doing the modern juggling act of parenting and existing simultaneously. The child was small, maybe 5 years old, maybe 6. Red anorak, trainers with what I think were dinosaurs on them. She walked right up to the boundary as close as she could get, and stood there looking up at Guard A with the total unself-conscious curiosity that only very small children and very experienced scientists can manage. Garda looked straight ahead. The little girl waited. She had the patience of someone who genuinely believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. She decided this man was going to respond to her, and she was prepared to wait as long as it took. The father called something from behind the buggy, distracted, not urgent. The girl didn't move. She said very clearly, in the particular loud voice of a child who has not yet learned to calibrate volume to social context, "Are you real?" Guard A's jaw shifted very slightly, barely perceptible, but I was looking at him through a 7200 lens and I caught it. He didn't answer, he couldn't not during duty, but the shift was there. And then something else. His eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance, moved for a fraction of a second downward. Not far, not enough that anyone not watching through a telephoto would notice. But he looked at her. Not at the crowd, not at the perimeter, at her. For less than 2 seconds, and then his gaze returned to where it was supposed to be. The father came and took the girl's hand, and she went with him, glancing back over her shoulder. Guard A was a statue again. But I'd seen that 2 seconds. I'd seen what the stillness was containing, and I filed it away without knowing I was filing it away, the way you store things you don't know you'll need yet. The other thing you should know about Guard A, and I learned this later, pieced together from a few conversations, and one longer one with a Metropolitan Police officer I know slightly who has connections to the ceremonial side of things, is that he was not simply a ceremonial guard. That distinction matters more than people realize. The household division guards at the royal palaces carry out what most people understand to be a ceremonial function. The changing, the marching, the stillness, the bearskin, the history pageant essentially, and it is that. But it is also not only that. These men are trained soldiers, active or recently active. Many have operational deployments behind them. Guard A, as I understand it, had served in a capacity that I won't specify because I was never given explicit permission to share it, but which involved the kind of environments where standing still for hours while being watched is actually one of the safer things you might be required to do. The intelligence is not incidental, it's part of the function. The ability to process a crowd, assess a situation, identify what's wrong about a scene before anything has gone visibly wrong, that's not decorative. That's the job. The uniform is old, the training is current. I didn't know this in full on that Tuesday morning, but I felt it in the way you feel craft when you see it. I'd been photographing this palace long enough to sense when a guardsman was going through the motions and when one was actively present, even in their stillness. Guard A was actively present. That Tuesday morning especially, though I wouldn't understand why until later. Now Queen Camilla. She had said something, we've established that. I'd caught fragments. The tone was light, lightly amused, lightly dismissive in that way that isn't quite condescension, but is adjacent to it, the way only people who are very comfortable in their authority can be. Like she was in on a joke that the joke himself wasn't aware of. And the aide smiled, and the protection officers held their ground, and Guard A did not move. What she said, as best I could reconstruct from what I heard and what I was later told by someone who was closer, was something along these lines. A remark about the guard's awareness. About whether, standing there for hours on end in the cold and the fog, staring at nothing, a person could really be said to be doing very much thinking at all. Whether the bearskin and the uniform and the standing still had left any room for her word. Apparently, observation. It was not vicious. I want to be fair to that. It was the kind of thing you might say on a slightly too long evening, 3 glasses in, when the guards are an abstraction, and you've stopped thinking of them as people who can hear. It was a remark born of proximity without connection. She was 15 feet from a man she probably thought of as part of the scenery. The aide laughed quietly. One of the protection officers looked at the pavement. Guard A heard it. Of this I am certain, not from any visible reaction because there was none, but because what happened next was too specific to be coincidence. He waited for her to finish. He waited for the small ripple of response from the group around her to settle. He waited, I think, for the exact moment when the remark had been received and accepted and filed as amusing, when it had, in other words, become established. And then he spoke. His voice was quiet enough that I had to piece it together afterward. But I was using a directional microphone attachment on a second body that morning. I do video work too, and when I reviewed the audio later, I got most of it. He addressed her correctly, formally and correctly in a way that wasn't stiff, just precise. Then he said, and I'm going to give you this as close to verbatim as I can. I noticed you at the far corner of Pall Mall, ma'am, when you turned onto St. James's Street at 8:47 this morning. You were wearing the same coat as yesterday's engagement in Kensington, which was photographed from across the road by at least 3 press photographers who have been positioned at the Pall Mall junction since 8:15. I have observed 11 members of the public attempt to enter the restricted zone this morning, of whom 2 appeared to have specific intent rather than ordinary curiosity, and both were noted to the duty officer at 9:07. I have also observed that the gentleman in the gray jacket who has been standing at the southeast corner of this courtyard for the past 22 minutes has changed position 3 times without appearing to move toward any particular destination, which I've already communicated. I'm sorry if the bearskin makes that difficult to see. That's the shape of it, 12 seconds, maybe 15. Quiet, not defensive, no edge in it. Not a performance of capability, just a statement of what had been happening calmly since before she arrived. The silence that followed was about 5 seconds long. In diplomatic terms, 5 seconds of silence after a statement is approximately equivalent to a full minute anywhere else. It was substantial. Queen Camilla stood there with her mouth very slightly open, not agape, not theatrical. Just fractionally open, the way a face opens when the brain needs a moment to catch up to something it wasn't expecting. Then she looked at him again. Different this time. I caught the frame I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. She was half-profile to me, the morning light still doing its amber thing on the buildings, guard A in the center of the frame with the palace behind him. And on her face, I've looked at this image more times than I can count since that morning, was something that moved through several registers in the space of about 2 seconds. First, the surprise, pure and unguarded as I've described. Second, a kind of recalibration, the face of someone updating a working assumption they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Third, and this is the one I find most interesting, photographically and otherwise, something that looked like genuine acknowledgement, not performed acknowledgement. Not the gracious nod that public figures learn to deploy as a kind of social management tool. The real thing, the slight compression of the lips, the almost imperceptible lowering of the head, the micro-expression of someone who has been shown something they didn't know was there and has the honesty to let it land. She said something. I got about half of it. Something like, you've been here since before 7 then. Not a question, a working out. Garda confirmed it. Yes, since 6:45. She said, and this I'm fairly sure of, I had no idea. And there was nothing performance about that either. It was just the truth, spoken by someone realizing they'd made an assumption about something they hadn't looked at closely enough. The aide had stopped smiling. The protection officers were doing the very professional thing of being invisibly present while being visibly elsewhere. Camilla looked at Guard A for another moment. Then she said something to one of the protection officers, short, quiet. The officer nodded. And then she did something I wasn't expecting. She didn't leave. She stood there for another few minutes, not in conversation with him, not performing anything for anyone. Just standing. The way someone stands when they've arrived at a place more completely than they expected to, and they're not quite ready to move on yet. I kept shooting. The light was perfect. To be continued in part 3. There are moments you photograph and moments you live. Usually, if you're carrying a camera, the camera is a kind of wall between you and the thing you're pointing it at. It gives you distance. It lets you observe without being part of the observation. 11 years of this work, and I have grown so used to the camera being between me and the world that sometimes I forget there's a me on the other side of it. That Tuesday morning was different. After Queen Camilla turned and spoke to her protection officer, and the group began to move, not rushed, just the ordinary movement of a day continuing, the way days do, I stood on that pavement and didn't take a single shot for nearly 5 minutes. I just watched. I watched Garda return to what he had been before she arrived. And that, I think, is the part of this that has stayed with me most. Not the exchange, not the 12 seconds of his voice carrying across the morning courtyard, not the expression on her face. Those are the things that are easy to talk about because they are narrative, they have shape, they have a before and an after. What stayed with me was the thing I watched happen in the 10 minutes after. He went back to his post. Not that he'd left it, he hadn't, not by a single step. But the world around him resumed. The fog continuing to thin, a delivery van going past on the street, 2 tourists arriving with a map held in the optimistic horizontal position of people who have never used a paper map in a city before. The morning resumed. And Garda resumed. Back to stillness. Back to that active, present, compressed attention that most people who walked past in the next 30 minutes would look at and see nothing in. Back to watching the corners, the sightlines. The man who had been loitering, who wasn't there anymore, I noticed. Gone, presumably communicated to the right people, the situation resolved quietly, without incident, without anyone other than Garda knowing there had been anything to resolve. Back to the job, which had never stopped, even during all the rest of it. That's the thing about this kind of work. The incident, whatever incident there is almost incidental to the work. The work is the sustained before and the sustained after. The incident is just the small visible portion of something that runs the whole length of every shift. Every day, in cold and in heat, and in fog and in sunshine, witnessed or unwatched, acknowledged or ignored. I thought about the little girl in the red anorak. Are you real? I stayed another hour. Partly for the light, which had gone from pale gold to a proper bright mid-morning by now. The mist burned off completely, and the palace stone looking almost warm in the direct sun. Partly because I had nowhere I had to be, and the kind of lingering feeling you get when something happens that you're not sure you've fully processed yet. I've had conversations since then about this, with other photographers. With my wife, who is less interested in royal protocol, but more interested in what I'd taken from it. With the police contact I mentioned earlier, who gave me more of the background on Guard A's service history that I referenced in Part 2. The reactions have been interesting. A lot of people, when I describe what Guard A said, focus on the content of it. The specifics, the watching from the corner of the mall, the 2 individuals with apparent intent, the loitering man at the southeast corner. They hear a catalog of professional observation and they think, impressive. They file it under guards are more switched on than we thought, and they move on the same way they'd file away any piece of interesting trivia. That's not quite what I took from it. What I took from it, and this took me a few days to articulate, even to myself, was something about the gap between being observed and feeling observed, between being watched and knowing you're being watched. We have this idea of visibility. We think if someone can see me, they're watching me. If they're watching me, they're aware of me. We're inside each other's awareness. But Queen Camilla hadn't felt watched. She'd felt invisible in the way that powerful people sometimes feel invisible, not in the sense of anonymity, obviously. She's not anonymous anywhere, but invisible in the sense that the man in the red box wasn't really registering her as a subject. He was part of the furniture of the place, and therefore she was part of the furniture of his view. And what Guard A's 12 seconds of quiet speech did was simply reverse that. He hadn't reacted to being observed. He demonstrated that he had been the observer all along, that the watching had been going one direction, hers, while the actual awareness had been going the other. She'd come to watch the ceremony and found that the ceremony had been watching her. That's what her face said, in the frame I can't stop looking at. That's what made her stand there for those extra minutes before she left. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'll finish. About 2 hours after all of this, I was at the corner of St. James's Street on my way back to where I'd parked the car, frame card full, hunger catching up with me, thinking about whether the cheese roll shop was open yet. I'd stopped to check my phone. My wife had texted twice, and I was standing against the wall in that absent way you stand when you're reading messages and the world can wait. A vehicle went past, official, dark, moving at the deliberate speed of cars that know the roads are being managed for them. Through the window, and I'm not going to make more of this than it was because I don't know if it means anything and I'm suspicious of neat endings, I caught a glimpse of a woman in a camel coat, profile to me, looking forward, not out the window. I didn't raise the camera. Too slow and too far, and honestly I wasn't sure I wanted to photograph it even if I'd had time. But in the second that the car was passing, the head turned. Just slightly. An adjustment in posture, or a response to something inside the car, or maybe just one of those random small movements that we perform 100 times a day without being aware of them. Or, and I acknowledge this is the version that makes a better story, which is exactly why I'm suspicious of it. She was looking at where the palace was, receding now through the rear window, looking back at where she'd been standing that morning. I don't know which it was. I couldn't see her eyes from where I was. The car went past, the street resumed. I put my phone in my pocket and started walking. The photographs from that morning I've shared too. The one I mentioned, Camilla half-profile, guard A centered, the amber light, and an earlier one before any of it, that I took in the fog when the morning was still just a quiet Tuesday and nothing had happened yet. Guard A in his box, the trees faint behind him, the whole city still soft and uncommitted. The fog one is the better photograph, technically. The other one, the one with her face in that moment, is the one I keep coming back to. It's not the composition. It's not the light, though the light is good. It's not even the expression exactly, though the expression is the thing that makes you stop. It's the fact that it contains a truth I wasn't looking for when I pressed the shutter. The assumption we carry about who is watching and who is watched, about where intelligence lives and where it doesn't, about the stillness that looks like absence and the attention that looks like nothing. He hadn't moved for hours, and he had missed nothing. She had moved through the whole morning with the confidence of a woman who was present and noticed, and she had missed him entirely. 12 seconds changed that. 12 seconds, quiet, specific, unapologetic, and the morning meant something different for everyone standing in it. I've been asked, since I started talking about this, whether I think Guard A knew what he was doing. Whether he chose those 12 seconds deliberately. Whether the remark about the bearskin at the end was calculated, or whether it just came out that way. I can't answer that. I don't know him. I watched him for one Tuesday morning through a telephoto lens and caught a few frames and a few seconds of audio and a lot of impressions. But I'll tell you what I think, for whatever that's worth. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Not in a point-scoring way, not in a let-me-prove-something way. In the way that someone who has done a job with integrity for long enough sometimes simply needs to say, this is what this is. Not for approval, not for acknowledgement, just because the record should be accurate. He didn't need her to know. He was going to keep doing the job whether she understood it or not. He would have stood there for the rest of his shift regardless. He would have logged the loitering man regardless. He would have noted the press photographers regardless. He would have kept watching, the corners, the sight lines, the man who is standing still in a way that isn't quite right, regardless. But she said what she said. And he made a choice. 12 seconds, quiet, correct, complete. And a queen who had arrived at that courtyard that morning, absolutely certain of what she was looking at, stood in the pale gold light, and discovered she had been wrong. London moves on. That's what London does. By the time I got to the sandwich shop, the tourist coaches had arrived and the whole stretch of the mall was rearranging itself around them, the ordinary machinery of the city reasserting itself after the brief parenthesis of the quiet morning. People with wheelie suitcases, a group of schoolchildren in matching yellow vests, someone trying to sell photographs from a kiosk. The fog was completely gone. I ate the cheese roll in the car and went through the frames on the back of the camera. The fog shot. The amber light shot. The face. A few others, the tourists, the little girl I'd mentioned, though I didn't include her in anything because she was a child and that's not my business to share. The card went onto my desk that evening and stayed there for 3 days. On the 4th day, I opened the files and looked at the image properly. The half-profile, the light, the expression. I've been a photographer for 11 years. I've had pictures that were technically extraordinary. Perfect light, perfect moment, exact composition. This one is not my best, technically, but it's the most honest photograph I've ever taken. Because it caught something true in the 2 seconds when the camera was there and the subject didn't know the truth was happening, when she was still moving between what she had thought and what she was about to know. That gap, that 2 seconds, that's where all the interesting photographs live. The guardsman at St. James's Palace stood in the fog for nearly 3 hours that morning before his relief arrived. He was never still. Not really. He just knew how to look like he was.